They say you never really own the land, you just care for it long enough to pass it on. That was something my father told me the day he handed me the deed to this property, nestled just beyond the reach of the suburbs, where the hills roll low and the soil remembers more than people do. For 27 years I lived here, worked here, breathed the crisp air coming off the stream that cut through the eastern edge of my acreage. That creek wasn't just water, it was memory. It fed the roots of the orchard my wife and I planted when our son was born. It nourished the pasture where our horses grazed. It cooled my hands after long days, fixing fences and replacing shingles. And it never once asked for anything in return. Until the day they tried to take it. I first noticed something strange in late spring. I was out near the southern fence line, checking on a section that had come loose during the last windstorm. The grass was high, the creek was low, and the hum of insects was thick enough to drown out thought. That's when I saw it, an orange stake in the ground near the creek, right on my side of the property line. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a utility crew marking underground lines. But when I followed the trail, I saw more stakes, each one connected by taut fluorescent string, forming a crooked rectangle that carved through my land like it belonged to someone else. I crouched beside one and saw the letters HOA Dev scrawled in Sharpie. My gut clenched. The HOA had always been aggressive. Ever since the development next door expanded 5 years ago, they'd made no secret of their ambitions. They wanted access to the creek. Wanted to build a nature-focused community feature with paddle boats, a duck pond, and benches etched with inspirational quotes. They'd proposed it twice at county meetings. Both times it was shot down largely because I stood up and showed them the original property lines, the environmental impact assessments, and the old water use rights that had belonged to my family since 1912. They didn't take that well. Still, I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected them to move in with markers and twine like squatters planning a new colony. I hadn't heard a word, no letter, no call, no formal notice. I pulled out my phone, snapped pictures of every stake, and went home, heart beating hard. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a whiskey and my land plat, trying to calm down. I couldn't. Because something in me, maybe all those years in the Army, maybe just plain instinct, told me this wasn't just an oversight. It was an invasion. The next morning, I took a walk along the creek from the upper bend near the cottonwoods down past the western edge of the pasture. That's when I saw the second sign tire tracks. Heavy ones like from a digger or loader pressed deep into the dirt near the access gate that backed up to HOA land. And the gate itself bent inward, the chain snipped and tossed in the grass. They'd already been in. I filed a police report. Sheriff's deputy came out, took some photos, nodded sympathetically, but his tone was lukewarm. Might be a civil matter, he said. Property disputes get murky. Murky. Like the water that used to run clear through my land. I tried to contact the HOA directly. Called their management company. Left voicemails. Sent emails. No response. Just silence until 3 days later when a white SUV rolled up to my gate and parked, engine humming. A woman stepped out. Blonde bob, clipboard heels, too thin for the gravel. Karen Whitlow, HOA president, local real estate broker, and self-proclaimed community visionary. She didn't even greet me, just looked over her sunglasses and said, "You should have known this was coming." I asked her what she meant. She smiled like a cat. The community board approved Phase 3 development last quarter. We need water features to increase property value. The land behind your orchard well, it's under review for annexation. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was insane. That's not how any of this works, I told her. She raised one penciled brow. You'd be surprised what a motivated community can accomplish. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up cross-referencing county zoning maps, permits, utility surveys, anything I could get my hands on. The more I looked, the more it seemed like they were trying to sneak something through, probably hoping I wouldn't notice until it was too late. But I noticed, and I wasn't about to back down. 2 days later, the bulldozers came. There were 3 of them, plus a backhoe and several workers in reflective vests moving with confidence like they owned the place. They started clearing brush near the creek, pushing back years of wild growth and breaking ground along the embankment. I came out screaming, shotgun in hand, not loaded just for show, and demanded they leave. They did, temporarily. The foreman left me with a printed memo, authorization granted by Silver Pines HOA, for community infrastructure improvements pursuant to Recreational Zoning Article 7B. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. None of it was legal. None of it was real. But the machines had still torn my land, my creek. I stood there until sunset alone, with the broken branches and the crushed grass listening to the trickle of the water as it slipped past the new scar in its path. They hadn't just trespassed. They'd declared war. The next morning, I was up before the sun. Not to check the animals or fix the gate, though both needed doing, but to wait. I set a chair at the edge of my gravel drive, cradled a thermos of black coffee in my hands, and sat facing the easterly ridge, right where the HOA land sloped down toward mine. My breath clouded the cold air, and I watched. I listened. And just after 7 a.m., they came again. A white pickup with magnetic decals reading Silver Pines Maintenance. Another SUV with tinted windows. Then a third vehicle I didn't recognize, a trailer hitched behind carrying what looked like surveying equipment and PVC markers. This time, they didn't even slow down. The lead driver tapped his horn like he was greeting an old friend and rolled right past me through the open access gate that led down to the creek bed. It had been wide open since they cut the chain last week. I hadn't replaced it yet. Something in me wanted to see how far they'd push it. Now I knew. I followed them down the hill on foot boots, heavy in the soft morning mud. They were already out unloading gear, staking new lines deeper into my property, measuring lengths with laser rangefinders. Not one of them acknowledged me until I stepped directly between two of them and yanked the plastic flags from the soil. Unless one of you has a court order or a permit issued by Flathead County, I said you're trespassing. A younger guy, barely 30, probably just a contractor, glanced up nervously. We were told this area was approved. By who? Silver Pines HOA, he muttered. I laughed sharp and dry. HOAs don't overrule land deeds. That's when the SUV door opened. Karen again, of course. This time she wore boots, expensive ones, and a long puffer jacket that screamed boutique catalog. She approached slowly like I was a stray she was trying to tame. We're conducting a hydrological survey, she said, eyes scanning a clipboard. It's preliminary, for planning purposes. I stared her down. You don't have jurisdiction here. Karen's voice dipped into that patronizing tone I'd heard once too often. Mr. Weller, you've made it clear you're resistant to change. But this project, this dam, it benefits the entire neighborhood. Controlled flow, wildlife conservation, recreational access. It's not just for us, it's for future generations. And my rights, my crops, my fence line. She sighed like she was tired of explaining basic math to a stubborn student. We're working with the city on a joint development agreement. You're lying. I didn't yell. I didn't wave the papers I'd printed from the county zoning office last night. I didn't need to. I just stared at her, and for the first time, something flickered in her gaze. Not fear, just hesitation. Doubt. But it passed. Her jaw stiffened. If you interfere again, she said, we'll involve legal counsel. This isn't your backyard anymore. It's a community resource. I took another step closer, close enough to see the reflection of the rising sun in her sunglasses. Then get off my land, before I file charges. She didn't move, but her contractors did. One by one, they packed their gear and retreated to their trucks. Karen held her ground a moment longer, then finally turned and climbed into her SUV without another word. That afternoon, I met with Roger Burns, my lawyer of nearly a decade, and one of the few people in this town who still used paper files. He read through the HOA documents I'd collected, scanned the plats I'd printed, and rubbed his temples like he could feel a headache forming. They're overstepping, he said. No question. But they're not stupid. They'll keep this in the gray zone. Blurred lines, verbal permissions, community vote language. They're hoping you back down before it gets expensive. I'm not backing down, I said. Roger nodded. Then we start documenting everything. Every stake, every vehicle, every communication. You don't speak to them again without me present. Over the next week, I followed his advice to the letter. I installed trail cams, hidden high-definition motion activated along the fence line and near the creek. I took time-stamped photos of each new intrusion, every piece of equipment, every vehicle. And I kept a written log, time date, weather conditions, and the names of every worker I could identify. And still they kept coming. Each time a little farther, a few more feet. A new marker closer to my orchard. Then came the trenching, small, shallow cuts, at first to run survey lines or test the soil, but deeper each day. By the second week, they had a miniature excavator on site and were digging what looked like the early foundation of a levee. I filed 2 more police reports. The deputies came, shrugged left. One even suggested I should consider mediation with the HOA board. Mediation, as if this was a disagreement over fence paint or mailbox height. One evening, just after sundown, I hiked to the edge of the new dig zone and found something that made my stomach drop, a laminated sign staked into the earth reading, "Future site of Silver Pines Reflection Lake, Phase 3, Community Enrichment Project. Estimated completion fall." There was no mention of my land, no asterisk, no footnote, just a glossy artist's rendering of a serene pond with little paddle boats and picnicking families. I almost tore it down, but I didn't. I left it, and I took pictures. That night, I stayed up late cross-referencing flood maps and reading through county codes. I'd built homes before. I'd poured concrete. And I knew something they didn't. This land, it shifted. Underneath all that topsoil was a hidden layer of clay that held water like a bathtub. Build a dam here, especially a shallow, poorly engineered one, and you weren't building a pond. You were building a time bomb. 2 weeks passed with nothing but quiet. Not peace, never peace, but quiet enough to make a man think maybe they'd backed off. The survey crews disappeared. No more tire tracks in the dirt. No more bright orange stakes snaking across my pasture. Even Karen Whitlow's smug SUV stayed absent from the horizon. I should have known it was too calm. A false retreat. I was splitting firewood behind the barn when my neighbor Glenn came rolling up on his four-wheeler visor pushed back, face flushed. "You see what's going on down by the bend," he said, panting. "They're pouring concrete, Weller. Big trucks work crews full operation." I dropped the axe mid-swing. By the time I reached the eastern slope of my property, the sounds had grown louder, engines groaning, men shouting, and the telltale metallic clank of rebar being driven into the earth. And when I crested the rise, what I saw stopped me cold. It wasn't some vague idea of construction anymore. They were building a damn dam. A long, ugly wall of poured concrete and stacked stone, already stretched nearly 20 feet across the creek bed, forming a crude barrier. The water, now backed up unnaturally, pooled into a widening reservoir behind it, slowly inching up toward my pasture fence. Excavators dug out trenches for side channels. Piles of gravel waited in dump trucks. Rebar bristled from freshly cured footings like rusted thorns. I could see men in reflective vests and hard hats, some local, some not, moving with the practiced pace of a job nearly done. They hadn't paused. They'd just waited for the weekend to hit hard and fast. My land was now a construction site, and I hadn't signed a single document. I stormed down the slope. Nobody stopped me. Most of them looked away when I passed, probably told I was the crazy old man who thought he owned what the HOA now claimed. I found the supervisor near the portable toilet's clipboard in hand and radio clipped to his vest. "You need to shut this down. Right now," I barked. He looked up, startled. "You're Weller." "Yes, this is my land. This is trespassing." He hesitated. "Ma'am said the paperwork was settled." "Ma'am who?" "Karen Whitlow. Said it was a community infrastructure project approved by the city. Gave us all the permits." He handed me a copy of something printed on letterhead, but not from the city. It was from Silver Pines HOA Infrastructure Committee. A joke, a farce. No legal standing, no city seal, just a bunch of signatures from board members who had no jurisdiction over my property. "Pull your men off," I said, "or I'll bring the sheriff out here again. This is the last warning." He didn't argue. Just sighed, looked over at the growing concrete slab and said, "We'll call it for the day." But I knew what that meant, a delay, not a stop. By nightfall, they were gone, but the dam remained. And now the damage was visible. The once free-running creek had slowed to a trickle downstream. My lower field, where I grew alfalfa, was beginning to yellow. The natural spring that fed the livestock trough had already run dry. Water was backing up fast behind the dam, soaking into places that had never known saturation. Trees near the embankment leaned unnaturally. The ground had begun to sag in places where it should have held firm. That evening, I sat on my porch, flipping through the oldest survey maps. I had one drawn by my grandfather's own hand, dated 1947. It showed the original water line, the natural floodplain, and a shaded warning. Unstable sediment zone. No build. They hadn't just trespassed. They were gambling with the earth itself. I called Roger again. This time I didn't wait for office hours. He answered groggily, but when I told him what I'd seen, he was wide awake within minutes. "Send me pictures," he said. "Everything you have. I'll get a letter drafted first thing Monday. We'll hit them with a cease and desist, then go to the county. And if they don't stop," there was silence. Then we sue." The next day, I drove to the county building with a binder full of evidence, photos, videos, plats, recorded timestamps, even a signed affidavit from Glenn, saying he'd witnessed trucks crossing into my land. I filed a formal complaint with the Zoning Commission, then went to the Water Authority, and requested an emergency site inspection. The clerk behind the desk raised her eyebrows when she saw the HOA's name on the papers. "You're not the first one," she muttered. "Not the first." That night, as I sat outside watching the moonlight glint off the unnatural pond rising on my land, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. A low groan, deep and distant, like the ground itself had started to whisper. I followed it down to the edge of the dam and stood there, flashlight in hand. The concrete looked solid, but I knew better. I crouched low and pressed my hand to the surface. It was warm. Then I saw it, a thin dark line running like a vein along one corner. A hairline crack. Already. The idiots hadn't even let it cure fully before they started flooding it. They'd built their monument to greed and power, and now it was starting to break. By early summer, my lower pastures had turned brittle. The creek that once hummed with life through my land now sat stagnant, choked behind the HOA's dam, its waterline held hostage. Every morning I walked the field, fingers grazing the dying stalks, listening to the silence where birds once nested and frogs once croaked. The earth cracked beneath my boots. My irrigation system sputtered and coughed, fed now by a trickle that couldn't reach pressure. The alfalfa crop failed first, then the clover. By the time the peach trees started dropping shriveled fruit in June, I knew I was watching years of work of care evaporate under the weight of someone else's arrogance. But the real insult came one morning when I drove past the neighborhood's west entrance and saw the banner. Grand opening this Saturday. Silver Pines Lakeside Clubhouse and Community Deck. I pulled over, heart hammering. A family of 3 was setting up helium balloons outside the gate, all smiles and matching shirts. Beyond the fence, I could see it clear as day. The dam had backed the creek up far enough to create a mirror-flat reservoir, now gleaming in the sun like a man-made lake. On its shore, they'd built a deck with Adirondack chairs, a dock with paddle boats, even a little cabana with a sign that read, "Residents Only." My water, my land, their leisure. The anger I felt then wasn't loud. It didn't rage or roar. It was cold, clean, like steel being drawn across a sharpening stone. I went home and opened the old metal filing box that had belonged to my father. Inside, beneath faded bank statements and yellowed warranty slips, was a worn manila envelope. My water rights. They were old. Some of them predated even the formal zoning of the area. My grandfather had filed them in 1933, securing legal rights to divert and use creek water for agricultural purposes on what was then one of the only homesteads in the region. Those rights were still valid, still registered, and crucially still enforceable. I called Roger. He reviewed the documents, then whistled low. They've built recreational infrastructure on top of an active water rights claim. That's serious. If the county sees this your way, they could be in violation of both zoning code and state water law. Then why hasn't the county stopped them? Because they don't know. Yet. So we made them know. Roger drafted a formal water rights infringement complaint, complete with copies of the deeds maps and historical usage logs. We submitted it to the state's Water Resources Division. I followed up with a call to the local environmental board, who agreed to send an investigator out within the week. But the HOA moved faster. 2 days before the inspector's scheduled visit, I found a fresh notice taped to my front gate. Notice of HOA violation, unauthorized structures, and nuisance landscaping. Attached were 3 grainy photos, one of my old barn, another of my leaning tool shed, and the last of a small compost pile behind my house. It was a scare tactic, a distraction. They were trying to make me look like the problem. I tore it down and called Karen directly. She answered on the second ring. "I don't know what you think you're doing," I said, "but it ends now. That dam floods 1 more inch onto my land, and you'll be answering to the state." She didn't flinch. "You're interfering with progress, Mr. Weller. This isn't personal, it's necessary. The community deserves amenities. Property values depend on it. I almost laughed. At what cost? There was a pause. Then she said colder than before, "We'll let the courts decide." Click. But it wasn't just Karen anymore. That weekend, while the HOA hosted ribbon cuttings and paddleboat tours on their glittering lake, I walked back through my fields and saw new rot. The orchard's root systems were failing too little water too late in the season. My topsoil, once moist and fragrant, now crumbled like dust through my fingers. It wasn't just the dam. It was the arrogance behind it. The belief that my land was just an obstacle between them and their next brochure photo. I made a decision that night. If the flood had to come to wake them up, then let it. But it wouldn't be from me. It would be from their own design. So I climbed into the attic and found the folder marked 1972 Flood. Inside were black and white photos, old engineering notes, and hand-drawn diagrams my grandfather had sketched when he built the original retention walls farther upstream. He'd studied the land, understood its weaknesses. He'd always warned us not to interfere too much with the creek's flow because if you held it back long enough, it'd find another way forward. They hadn't listened, but soon they would. And it wouldn't be long, because just beneath that glossy new dam, beneath the press releases and paddle boats and parasols, was a shelf of unstable clay. Shifting, saturating, waiting, and the water was rising. The first letter came folded in half and taped to my mailbox. No envelope, no postage, just HOA letterhead with a fake-friendly font and a list of non-compliance observations. They said I had 30 days to fix visual blight caused by my toolshed, remove unapproved vegetation along the fence line, and clear the obstruction to community access, which according to them was a fallen tree limb from the last storm that lay near the boundary line. A tree that was very much still on my land. The second letter arrived 3 days later, this one in a certified envelope sent via a law firm, with a name that sounded made up for TV McMillan and Drake. Inside was a cease and desist, accusing me of harassment, of contractors, interference with public utility work, and obstruction of community infrastructure development. They weren't just poking anymore, they were digging in. Roger reviewed the documents with that dry look he gave when something was both ridiculous and dangerous. "They're fishing," he muttered. "Trying to get you to make a mistake. Get angry, lash out. Something they can use." "They've already built a dam on my land," I said, jaw tight. "What more do they need?" He pointed to the last paragraph in the letter. It threatened to seek a restraining order if I continued entering active work zones. My land called a work zone. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. "They're trying to box me out of my own damn property." "They can try," Roger said. "But we're not going to play their game. We escalate legally." So we filed a counterclaim, trespassing environmental damage, unauthorized land use, and willful violation of water rights. Roger added 2 notarized affidavits, one from Glenn and another from a retired county surveyor who confirmed the dam's placement was well inside my boundaries. And then we waited. But the HOA didn't. They ramped up everything. 2 more violation notices showed up, one accusing me of unauthorized gatherings because Glenn had visited and parked his ATV near the gate, and another citing my barn's structural hazards, likely because I dared to repair the roof without submitting blueprints for approval. Then came the knock on my door. It was just after 6 p.m. The sun had dipped low, turning the sky a bruised orange. I opened the door, expecting a delivery driver or maybe Roger. Instead, it was 2 men in matching navy polos, embroidered with Silver Pine's HOA enforcement. Not deputies, not city code officers, just self-appointed rule keepers with clipboards and forced smiles. "Evening, Mr. Weller," one of them said. "We're here to document code violations for the board. This'll just take a few minutes." I didn't open the screen door. "You're trespassing." He smiled wider. "According to the HOA's Community Expansion Ordinance, we're entitled to inspect adjacent shared use boundaries. There's no such thing. Actually," he said, pulling out a laminated printout, Section 12.4c allows visual confirmation of compliance on properties abutting development zones. "That development zone," I said, pointing toward the dam, "is under legal dispute. And this property is not governed by your HOA. His smile twitched. "You can refuse, of course, but that would be considered non-cooperative, and we'll be forced to note that in our records. Note whatever you want. Step foot past that gate, and I'll call the sheriff." They didn't argue, just took a few exaggerated photos of my fence, one of my truck, and then walked back to their car like they'd won something. That night, I installed motion sensor lights around the property. And for the first time in years, I slept with a shotgun beside my bed. Not for the coyotes, but for the cowards in polos who thought intimidation was governance. The next morning, a woman from the state water board arrived. She introduced herself as Denise Yarrow, showed her badge, and stood silent for a long moment, looking over the dam with her arms crossed. "This shouldn't be here," she finally said, "and it shouldn't look like that." She pointed out several things: unreinforced joints, uneven curing stress fractures along the south base. Then she asked me to walk with her downstream. We passed my wilted orchard, the cracked earth, the bent grass where water used to run. When we reached the natural runoff basin, she pulled out a moisture meter and sank it into the dirt. The reading came back bone dry. "I'm going to file an emergency assessment," she said. "But don't expect instant action. They'll push back hard, especially if they think this is political." "It's personal," I said. "They're building a monument to themselves with the bones of my land." She nodded, eyes narrowed. "Then document everything. Be louder than them. Truth usually gets drowned when the water rises." Before she left, she handed me her card. "Call me if anything changes, especially the structure. If it shifts, leaks, or groans, call me." I didn't have to wait long. That weekend, after another heavy rain, I hiked down to the dam to check the base. The water level behind it had climbed nearly 2 feet. The surface tension shimmered like glass, silent pressurized. But along the southern corner, I saw something new. A damp crescent of darkened concrete spreading slowly like a bruise. The crack had grown, widened. It was weeping. The dam was no longer just a violation of property law. It was a loaded gun pointed at the neighborhood, and it was their finger on the trigger. I stood at the base of that dam, staring at the dark streak like it was a wound on the skin of something diseased. My fingers touched the concrete, and it felt wrong, too damp, too warm for a surface that should have been cool and solid. I could feel it, a slow pulse, like pressure building from beneath. The kind of pressure that doesn't whisper warnings. It explodes. I didn't need to guess anymore. I knew what I was looking at. And it wasn't just a crack. It was a ticking clock. I went back home, pulled out the old binder I'd started assembling since the first orange stake appeared. Every photo timestamp, inspection note map. I flipped to the diagram I'd copied from my grandfather's notebook, the one marked unsettled clay shelf. The dam sat right on top of it. 1,000 tons of weight where the earth refused to hold anything permanent. I spent the next day compiling a new report. I used a laser level to chart the slope changes on the south side of the dam. I noted small depressions in the soil, slight shifts in the retaining wall's alignment. I even borrowed a drone from Glenn's nephew to capture overhead footage of the reservoir expanding far beyond the originally marked lines. At night, I edited the video together with captions, dates, and annotations. I uploaded it to a private cloud and gave Roger access. Then I emailed Denise Yarrow. By Monday morning, I got her reply. "Received. Reviewing immediately. I'll be back out this week. Stay safe." But the HOA, they doubled down again. Tuesday morning, a team of landscapers hired by the HOA arrived with chainsaws and began cutting through the brush near my northern fence. They said they were clearing sight lines for safety patrol visibility. It was an excuse to intrude. I caught one of them leaning over the fence, snapping photos of my tractor shed. I called the sheriff. Deputy Ramos showed up friendly as ever, but tired of the same song. He nodded at the boundary marker I'd repainted in bright orange. "They're claiming this isn't the line anymore. It's the same line it's been for 85 years, I said. Same as it was when their grandparents were still renting in the valley. He sighed, took some notes, then turned to me quietly before leaving. "Off the record, word is Karen has a connection on the zoning board. She's trying to push a retroactive boundary adjustment. They think they can redraw the past." I stared at him. "They're not just moving lines. They're burying a bomb." That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself back at the dam, just past midnight, flashlight in hand, walking its edge like a security guard on night watch. The moonlight reflected off the reservoir's surface, and I could hear the water lapping more aggressively than before. A constant wet slap against the concrete lip. And then I heard it. A sound I hadn't heard since my time overseas, a long, low groan like steel under strain. Not loud, but deep. It came from inside the dam. I crouched, shined my light along the lower joint, and saw it a spiderweb of fissures radiating outward from the original crack. Water seeped through in beads. Not a leak yet, but close. Too close. The next morning, I printed stills from the drone footage highlighted the reservoir's overextension, the widening breach, the visible slope distortion along the south embankment. I called the local news desk. They brushed me off at first until I emailed the footage. 2 hours later, I had a voicemail from a reporter named Shelby Brantley, Channel 6 Investigative. She wanted to see it for herself. By that afternoon, she was on site walking the dam's perimeter with me, camera in hand, her brow furrowed deeply. When I told her about the soil, the fake permits, the dam's unpermitted location, her eyes widened. They built this without hydrological clearance. No study, no soil report, no environmental impact form, and they built it on a shelf of clay. She looked at me like I'd said they'd built it on dynamite. By the time she left, she had enough footage to sink the HOA's credibility for good. But Karen wasn't going quietly. The next day, the HOA issued a statement on their website accusing me by name of sabotage, misinformation, and uncooperative obstruction of civic progress. They called the dam a sustainable water feature, claimed I was an aggrieved individual with outdated property claims, and ended it with, "Progress cannot be stopped by bitterness." That line lit a fire in me, because it wasn't bitterness driving me. It was the memory of my father, wading into this same creek to show me how water always tells the truth. It was the years of labor, the calloused hands, the mornings spent in the fog watching deer sip from the same stream they'd just sealed behind a wall. It was justice for the land, for the law, for everyone who thought progress meant pretending nothing existed before the HOA drew a line on a map. Friday morning, Shelby's segment aired, and the footage, it went viral. The drone shots, the close-ups of the cracking dam, the history of ignored warnings. She even included an excerpt from her interview with Denise Yarrow, who cautiously said, "In my professional opinion, the dam may be at risk of partial failure if current saturation trends continue." It was the first time someone besides me had said it aloud. The neighborhood was no longer silent. I got calls from 3 other landowners near the creek asking if I thought their foundations were at risk. HOA members started showing up to board meetings demanding answers. Glenn said Karen hadn't been seen outside in 2 days. And the weather, it was turning. Storms were forecasted for the weekend. Heavy rains, high winds. The kind of pressure nature builds quietly until it doesn't anymore. That night, I stood at the edge of the reservoir again and stared across the dam toward the clubhouse lights shimmering in the distance. They were hosting a wine night, soft jazz, string lights, laughter floating across the water like they were safe, like they had all the time in the world. They didn't know, but soon they would. The rain started that Saturday just after noon, soft at first, a whisper on the porch roof. I was tightening the canvas tarp over the tractor when the first wind came. Not strong yet, but insistent. The kind that pulls at your collar and makes you look up. The forecast said 1 to 2 inches. They were wrong. By 4 p.m., it was coming down in sheets. Wind drove it sideways, hammering the barn doors, battering the windows like fists. Water raced down the slope, soaking the already saturated soil, gathering in rivulets along the creek bed and the new reservoir beyond. I kept checking the live feed from my drone stationed just above the dam on a scheduled hover. The image was grainy through the storm, but the water line had already risen 6 inches since morning. It lapped high on the dam's concrete lip, pushing against the sides. The cracks were darker now, more pronounced. At 5:43 p.m., I saw the first breach. A plume of muddy water burst from the southern base, brief like a cough. Then another. Then a steady trickle flowing down the embankment, carving a channel through the clay below. I called Denise. She didn't answer, straight to voicemail. Then I called the county emergency line. "This is Edward Weller. I have video evidence of an active dam failure on my property, built by Silver Pines HOA. I repeat, the dam is leaking, actively breaching, and their clubhouse is directly downstream." The dispatcher asked for my coordinates. I gave them. Then I threw on my jacket and grabbed my camera. By 6:15, the breach had worsened. The dam still held, but barely. The south corner had eroded enough to create a trough the size of a car tire, and water poured through it like a busted fire hose. Sediment followed, darkening the flow into a slurry of mud and gravel. Trees near the base had begun to lean. And yet across the water, the clubhouse was aglow with lights and voices. Music, laughter. They had no idea. I climbed the ridge near the top of the dam and waved my flashlight toward the clubhouse like a signal flare. Then I took the radio Glenn had lent me and tuned to the HOA's emergency frequency, something I'd learned they kept open for safety coordination. This is Edward Weller. The dam is breaching. Evacuate the clubhouse immediately. Do you read me? Silence. I repeated it. Still nothing. At 6:32, I heard the sound that made my stomach lurch, a groan deeper than anything I'd heard before, followed by a pop. Not an explosion, not yet, but the unmistakable crack of concrete under too much pressure. The reservoir surged the entire surface, lifting and pushing toward the weakened corner. And then it began. A sliver of the southern wall gave way, vanishing in an instant, beneath a torrent of water. The pressure released like a monster, exhaling all at once. The breach widened rapidly, water pouring over and through the failure point, gaining speed with every second. Within a minute, half the dam was gone. What followed wasn't just a flood, it was a wall of sound and fury. A rush of brown foaming water tearing through the dam's remains, racing down the channel that had once been the creek bed and now carved its own path with brutal efficiency. I ran to higher ground, panting soaked, recording everything with my phone, as the flood barreled forward. The clubhouse stood directly in its path. It hit like a freight train, water slamming into the east-facing windows, shattering them instantly. Patio furniture floated, then vanished. The dock snapped in two boats, crushed beneath it like toys. Screams pierced through the storm as people finally realized what was happening. The water rose fast, ankle then knee, then waist deep within minutes. Cars parked near the edge were swept away. One white BMW twisted sideways, hit a light post, and disappeared beneath the surge. From the hill, I could see people waiting out, some helping others. Lights flickered inside the clubhouse. I saw Karen, her blonde hair matted against her cheeks, standing in the doorway staring at the water like it had betrayed her. She didn't scream. She just stood there frozen as the water licked at her knees. The sheriff's deputies arrived around 6:50, wading in from the west side with flashlights and ropes shouting instructions. Emergency crews followed minutes later. Someone pulled Karen out by the arm. Someone else carried an elderly woman wrapped in a soaked shawl. And I kept filming. By 7:20, the worst had passed. The water spread across the lower fields, now no longer channeled by the dam, but by the land's natural curves. The clubhouse was a shell, flooded, shattered the lawn, torn up like it had been clawed by a god. The lake was gone, just muck and silence. That night, I sat in the living room with every light off. Just me, the dog, and the weight of everything I'd seen. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet, because even as the water drained, I knew what was coming next. Blame. Spin. They'd say it was sabotage. They'd say I orchestrated it. But I had the footage. I had the documents. And this time, the entire town had seen what happened when power ignored warning. When vanity tried to damn nature. And lost. By sunrise, the water had receded enough to see the bones. The clubhouse was unrecognizable, its white siding streaked with mud, its glass doors shattered, gaping open like broken teeth. Folding chairs bobbed in the shallows that still clung to the lower level. Flower beds had been reduced to islands of mulch. The paddle boats were gone. One of them, I later found, had drifted nearly half a mile downstream and lodged in the branches of a cottonwood. It wasn't just damage, it was ruin. And it was theirs. I arrived just after 7 a.m., drone in hand, boots coated in clay. A sheriff's cruiser blocked the main road, but I took the back trail Glenn and I had cleared years ago when we used to hunt coyotes out this way. As I crested the ridge that overlooked the clubhouse, I saw them carrying 3 other HOA board members, a handful of residents, and 2 men in suits I didn't recognize. They were standing in a muddy semicircle around the collapsed remains of the dock, talking in low, panicked voices. Karen saw me first. Even through the mud, she looked composed, hair pinned back, blazer still buttoned despite the damage. But her eyes? They had changed. There was no smugness left in them. Only disbelief. The face of someone whose version of reality had just split down the middle. "You did this," she said. Not shouted, not screamed, just stated like a sentence she'd rehearsed all night. "No," I replied just as calm. "You did. You ignored the warnings, built illegally, flooded my land, and now it came back to you. She stepped forward, her boots sucking at the mud. "You've been sabotaging us from the beginning. You tampered with the structure. You made it fail." One of the men in suits raised a hand. "Let's not make accusations without evidence." "I have evidence," I said, holding up the drone controller. I clicked a few buttons, and the screen lit up with footage from last night. The crack, the breach, the wall collapsing. I panned to the timestamp, 6:35 p.m., overlaid with GPS coordinates. I scrolled to the videos from last week. The inspection with Denise, the seepage, the hairline fractures she'd flagged. The man closest to Karen leaned in to look. His face went pale. "You knew?" he asked, her voice low. Karen didn't answer. I kept going. Pulled out the physical folder Roger and I had assembled. Maps, permits, historical plats, water rights. The email from Denise's office. I handed them to the second man. He was from the county engineer's office, as it turned out. By the time he was halfway through, his lips were pressed in a thin, white line. "We'll be launching a formal inquiry," he said, "effective immediately. No one is to tamper with the site. This is now a controlled area." Karen bristled. "Controlled by who?" "Not you," he said simply. The news crews arrived by 10 a.m. Shelby Brantley came first again. She stepped out of a muddy SUV, camera in hand, eyes sharp as ever. "You warned them," she said to me, shaking her head. "I've never seen public infrastructure fail this dramatically in a suburban neighborhood, ever." She filmed everything: the wreckage, the damaged homes adjacent to the floodplain. Even the HOA notice board near the front gate still soaked and unreadable, its messages running like wet ink. By noon, the story had hit local news websites. By evening, it was on national affiliates. Unpermitted, HOA dam fails in suburb, floods, luxury clubhouse. Public sympathy did not fall where Karen hoped. Residents were furious, not just at the destruction, but at the secrecy, the lies, the silence. Within 48 hours, a petition circulated demanding the immediate resignation of the entire HOA board. 3 members stepped down the next day. Karen held a press conference, more like a desperate plea, in front of the neighborhood sign, insisting the collapse had been caused by an unprecedented weather event and interference by hostile actors. She tried to pivot, offering healing and rebirth as the community rebuilt. No one listened, because by then the real documents were public. Denise had released a preliminary report to the state. The dam had been built on untested clay, with no formal hydrological survey, no permits, and in direct violation of 2 land use codes and 1 environmental protection clause. Roger and I filed a civil suit on the 4th day. It included claims for damages to agricultural property, loss of revenue from crop failure, violation of registered water rights, emotional distress, trespassing, and property destruction. We added my drone footage, Shelby's interviews, Denise's statement, even testimony from the contractor foreman who had gone on record saying he raised concerns about the foundation being unstable. Karen went quiet after that. No more press, no more appearances. Rumor had it she skipped town for a vacation in Florida. The neighborhood board dissolved 2 weeks later. The county placed a temporary manager in charge until new elections could be held. One of the residents, a retired judge named Dana, personally called to apologize for ever doubting me. "It's not just about HOA," she said. "It's about power, about what people do when they think no one's watching." I told her I hadn't stopped watching since the first stake went in the ground. Cleanup took months. The clubhouse was deemed a total loss. The insurance companies balked, most refused to pay, citing unauthorized construction and negligent land alteration. The HOA's reserve funds were drained in lawsuits, home values dropped. Residents began to leave. As for my land, it healed slowly. The creek returned to its old path. The broken dam, now reduced to chunks of rebar and gravel, was finally cleared by a county crew. I planted wildflowers along the old reservoir's edge and watched as ducks came back. So did the deer. So did the silence. But not the kind you fear. The kind you earn. It's strange how quickly a place can become infamous. A month ago, Silver Pines was just another affluent suburban enclave with manicured lawns, tennis courts, and a clubhouse that made the neighborhood look like a vacation brochure. Now it was the center of an unfolding investigation, its name mentioned nightly on local news as a cautionary tale of arrogance, negligence, and unchecked power. The wreckage had become a kind of monument, News crews still parked along the gravel road near the ridge, setting up tripods and recording updates in front of the broken concrete and warped signage. Remains of an unauthorized dam, the captions always said. Behind them, water still trickled over the land, reclaiming its natural path, as though the dam had never been there. But the paper trail didn't vanish so easily. By the second week, a team of inspectors from the State Attorney General's office arrived. They weren't here for photos, they were here for facts. They spread out with measuring wheels, topographic scanners, clipboards filled with codes and statutes. They knocked on doors, interviewed residents, requested files from the now disbanded HOA. And when the HOA's former treasurer refused to cooperate, they subpoenaed him. I knew something had shifted when one of the agents knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Marshall Trent, tall gray suit, state badge, and asked if I'd walk him through everything from the beginning. I led him to the barn, where I'd laid out maps and documents like it was an evidence locker. The drone footage, the water rights, the survey plats dating back to the 1930s. He asked careful questions, took notes, and said little. But when I showed him the folder titled Pre-Collapse Correspondence, containing every warning I'd sent to the HOA, including the email to Karen timestamped 2 days before the breach, he finally looked up. They knew, he said. Yes. He nodded, and they acted anyway. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. That week, subpoenas were issued for 7 former HOA board members. Shelby Brantley ran a follow-up story titled Negligence or Cover-Up Dam Collapse Prompts Criminal Inquiry. It went national, and the residents, God help them, were waking up. A group of them started attending county council meetings, holding signs that read, "We were lied to and my family could have died." One man, a father of 2, stood before the mic with tears in his eyes and described how he had to carry his 6-year-old through waist-high water because of a board that wanted lake views more than safety. More resignations followed. Contractors cut ties. The HOA's management company scrubbed its name from the website. But for me, justice didn't come from the cameras or headlines. It came from the courtroom. We filed our civil suit in district court that August, listing Karen Whitlow and 5 other board members by name. Roger, always methodical, laid it out with surgical precision: trespassing, destruction of property, loss of crop, yield, illegal diversion of a water source, and emotional distress. We asked for damages, and more importantly, we asked for injunctive relief permanently preventing any future HOA from claiming jurisdiction over my land. Karen filed a countersuit, of course, claiming defamation, harassment, and intentional sabotage. But it didn't last long. Once discovery began, her bluff unraveled fast. The construction firm she'd hired, they'd never seen a certified permit. The engineer who signed off on the dam's design turned out he wasn't licensed in this state. The foundation core sample never conducted. And the kicker, emails between Karen and a real estate developer discussing how a lake would raise property values by 20 to 30% within 18 months and create optics favorable to Phase 4 expansion. She had planned it all not for the community, but for a deal that never got approved. When those emails were read aloud in court, she closed her eyes and didn't open them until the judge dismissed her countersuit with prejudice. It was over. The court awarded me full damages, enough to restore my orchard replace equipment and cover every legal bill I'd racked up since the first orange stake hit my field. More than money, they granted the injunctive order I'd asked for: no HOA now or ever could set foot on my land again. Not with authority, not with enforcement, not with lies dressed up in letterhead. I stepped out of the courthouse that day, not with joy, but with something quieter relief. Like finally exhaling after holding your breath for a year. Shelby met me on the steps, microphone in hand, camera rolling. "Mr. Weller," she said, "do you think this is a win for private landowners?" I paused, thought about it, looked out at the city skyline beyond. "No," I said. "It's a warning that people who think they're untouchable usually aren't, and that land remembers. It always remembers." The following week, a group of residents from Silver Pines approached me not as a board, but as neighbors. They wanted to apologize. One woman, Emily, hugged me, said she'd trusted the HOA because they seemed so confident. Another man, Gary, offered to help plant new fencing. A few even volunteered to help restore the orchard. I accepted. Not because I needed help, but because for the first time in a long while, they saw me. Not as the angry old landowner or the man who blocked the lake, but as someone who'd tried to protect what was right, and had finally been heard. By the time autumn rolled in, the land had begun to breathe again. The orchard, which had once stood brittle and gray, was slowly coming back to life. I'd pruned the dead limbs, tilled the soil, and dug new trenches to help the roots recover. Rain returned in measured doses, not as floods, not as vengeance, but as balance. A kind of natural mercy, the kind that asks nothing in return. Down by the creek, the wildflowers had started to bloom again without anyone planting them. As if the earth remembered what it was before concrete and paddle boats and board meetings tried to reimagine it. It was healing, and so was I. There was a day not long after the trial ended when I found myself sitting beneath the cottonwood near the old bend of the creek. The same spot where my son used to fish when he was young. Where my father once showed me how to track deer. Where my grandfather, I imagine, first realized this land was a place worth keeping safe. The sun filtered through the leaves. The wind moved slow and sure. I didn't feel triumphant. No raised fists, no victory lap, just peace. And it had been a long time since I felt that. The community around Silver Pines changed too, whether they wanted to or not. With the HOA board dissolved and their clubhouse condemned, they formed a temporary neighborhood committee this time, with actual transparency. Elections were held. A new charter was drafted, one that defined the limits of their authority, with language that had my fingerprints all over it. One clause in particular. No homeowners association may assert jurisdiction over land not included in its original plat, regardless of proximity usage or perceived benefit. That clause, that was mine, word for word. Karen never showed up again. Word was she moved to Phoenix, started fresh. I didn't care. I wasn't out for vengeance. I didn't want her ruined. I just wanted her gone from my land, from my creek, from the corner of my mind where she'd lived rent-free for nearly a year. And she was. Glenn came by one afternoon with 2 six-packs and a pack of jerky. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the sunset over the ridge. He glanced toward the creek and gave a low whistle. Hard to believe there was a dam here just a few months ago, he said. I nodded, like it was never real. But it was. He sipped his beer. You ever think you'd win? No, I said honestly. I just knew I couldn't let it slide. He clinked his bottle against mine. Well, here's to the man who didn't slide. In early November, I received a package from the state. Inside was a formal declaration from the Department of Environmental Quality. It recognized the restoration of the waterway, the natural rehabilitation of the floodplain, and the lawful enforcement of water rights. It also included a certificate naming the original Weller Creek Channel a protected heritage watershed. My grandfather's name was on that certificate. So was mine. I framed it and hung it in the barn. Not out of pride, but remembrance. The final piece came in December right before the first snow. I walked down to where the dam had once stood. Nothing remained but smooth ground and new shoots of grass. I stood in the middle of that open space and listened. And for the first time in nearly a year, I heard the creek again. Not muffled, not strangled. Just flowing clear, free, unbothered. I crouched beside it, ran my fingers through the cold water, and let it run between my knuckles. This land had seen so much. People who thought they could tame it. People who tried to exploit it. People who forgot what it meant to be a steward of something instead of its master. But the land never forgot. It waited. It endured. And when the moment came, it spoke in the only language it knew: flood and fracture, collapse and consequence. Not out of rage, out of balance. And I had listened. I never intended to become a symbol. I'm just a man with boots, a fence line, and a creek that knows my name. But if this story means anything, let it be this. Power borrowed without consent always comes due. Nature doesn't sign contracts. And if you build your kingdom on someone else's soil without asking, don't be surprised when it washes away in the night. Because land remembers, and water always finds its way home.